it changes us chemically and it changes the anatomy of the heart.
That's what chronic depression and stress can do to the physical structure of your heart. And people aren't talking enough about that.
Hey, it's Dr. Phil. Thanks for tuning back in to Fill in the Blanks. Remember to download for free, subscribe, rate, and share, especially this episode, because this episode has really high stakes. I predict that you can learn something today that absolutely, literally, no hype, can save a life. Maybe yours, maybe a friend, maybe a loved one, but you're going to get tools today that can actually cause you to save a life. It may cause you to mobilize yourself, do some things that it could be yours, or maybe, as I said, it could be somebody that you care about, or it could be a total stranger. One person dies every minute in America of heart disease. One person every minute dies of heart disease in America. Now, this is preventable. It's not 100% preventable, but we can really have an impact on this, and it can start with you. This is like a day off for me because I'm talking to my really good friend, Chief Medical Officer of WebMD, Dr. John Whyte. He's been on before, and I have lured him back again to discuss his new book, Take Control of Your Heart Disease Risk. He says despite advances in diagnosis and treatment, heart disease remains a major cause of illness and death. But by proactively living a heart-friendly lifestyle, you can mitigate your risk for years to come. You have the power to reduce your risk. That's a direct quote. We're also addressing something that doctors just don't really get into, maybe because it just wasn't emphasized when they went through their training, maybe because it takes too much time, maybe because there's not really a medication for it. But I'm talking about the role our emotions, especially depression, anxiety, and stress, play in heart disease. And when I say they play a role in heart disease, I mean it actually impacts the chemistry in the body, the anatomy of the heart, and can contribute to whether you have a heart attack or whether you don't. So if you're somebody that struggles with depression, anxiety, stress, loneliness, you need to perk up and listen because this could be contributing to your risk of having a life-altering or life-ending cardiac event. It's time to stop ignoring this mind-body connection when it comes to our heart. I've got Dr. Whyte here. I'm going to stop talking about him and start talking to him. Welcome back, John.
Dr. Phil, thanks for having me. And thank you for writing not only the foreword to the book, which you did, but also helping educate me through our numerous discussions about that mind-body connection, about the role of our emotions. So thank you.
Well, I don't know that I taught you anything you didn't know, but maybe we freshened up our awareness going back and forth. And I think we do that. When you and I talk, I think we play off each other. We kind of rekindle some things we haven't thought about for a while and go back and forth. And I think you've forgotten more about the mind-body connection and heart health than I've ever known, but you certainly bring it back into focus. And I've really enjoyed our conversations about this. We talk about these things, whether they're popular in the medical and psychological community or not, because there's empirical science to back this up. I think that's important, that we tell people the truth about what's going on in their bodies and what's going on in their minds and how those interact.
But I've never really made it a priority in the past until we really started to have our discussions about emotions and mental health. So like a lot of other doctors, I didn't spend a lot of time on it. Whereas now I realize it plays an integral role that if you want to reduce your risk of a heart attack, you just can't focus on diet and exercise. You need to focus on your emotions as well.
And that's kind of the thing that most people think about, not to discount those things, because they're absolute building blocks to heart health, right? If you diet, you exercise, you eat right, you break a sweat, you don't have to be an athlete to do it, just that you keep your feet moving, you have some activity, you avoid some of the toxic foods, you eat some of the healthy foods. that is a major step in the right direction of mitigating your risk for heart disease.
Yeah, and to be fair though, when you're depressed or you're anxious, you're not thinking about, oh, I need to go to the gym or I need to go for a walk. You're not thinking about, oh, maybe I'll have fish, for dinner. You're not focused on anything that's impacting your health, and that makes it worse.
Yeah, let's talk about this generally, and then I want to get into some specifics because you identify some hormones in the body, some changes in the anatomy of the heart that go along with some of these emotions. But I want to talk about what you just said first, which is more general. I want people to think about this. There are certain lifestyle changes that go along with certain emotions that have a profound effect on us constitutionally, just our overall health and specifically our heart. To give a real straightforward example, people that are depressed, generally speaking, are less active. Let's talk about that commonsensically. We all know that if we get fewer rewards from life, that we tend to be less positive and more subject to being negative, which leads to a greater risk of being depressed, whether it's clinical depression or you're just down. So if you are less active, you have psychomotor depletions in your baseline or whatever. I think old sayings get to be old sayings because they're profound. Old sayings like, you can't get a hit if you're not swinging. If you have fewer chances at bat, you're going to have fewer hits. So if you don't put yourself out there, you have less opportunities to get a win. You have less opportunities to get rewards from life. And if you are depressed, you're less active. So if you're less active, the chance of getting rewarded, getting encouragement, having a win at work, having a win socially or with friends, you become more withdrawn, less engaged in the world. There's less opportunities for you to get reinforced, right?
That's right.
Okay, so if that happens, then you tend to withdraw more. You're going to be less active, which means the building blocks we talked about, you're going to probably have less tendency to exercise. You're not going to think about your diet as much. You're not going to be as active in managing your lifestyle. So just generally speaking, depressed people don't focus on their grooming as much. They don't focus on activity as much. They don't have as many opportunities to get reinforced. And I've always called it an auto-exacerbating disease for that reason, because the less you do, the less rewards you get, the less rewards you get, the less you do, the less you do, the less rewards you get. It's like circling the drain. It just gets worse and worse and worse. In that way, it hurts us because we don't have as much opportunity to get rewarded. That's bad. But it goes beyond that. It changes us chemically and it changes the anatomy of the heart. Talk about that some.
And it's not just mumbo jumbo. I think, sometimes people think, oh, well, stress is bad and, depression impacts your health. But as you point out, there's a biochemical reason and it relates to hormones. So what we see in people with depression is really this chronic inflammation. And if we measure, and I talk about in the book, this something called C-reactive protein, which is a measure of stress. People that are depressed have elevated levels of C-reactive protein. And that's not a good thing to have because inflammation, when you have it chronically, damages our blood vessels. It causes something known as endothelial dysfunction. Fancy words for it messes up the lining of your blood vessels. So it makes them less elastic. Imagine if you had a garden hose and there were kinks in it or it didn't able to supply, water, you're not going to get important nutrients to your flowers, to your grass. It's the same thing in our heart. If our blood vessels aren't functioning well, we're not going to get good blood supply. So there's that biochemical reason of inflammation and C-reactive protein. It's all related to cortisol, and we've heard about that in terms of the stress hormone. But it's also norepinephrine, epinephrine, adrenaline, sometimes people will call that. And, in acute stress, when you're in a dangerous situation, those are helpful, but not when it's chronic, because that's going to clamp down on your blood vessels. That's going to change the way that your platelets function. So there's that biochemical reason. And then there's also, as you talked about, the actual changing of the shape of the heart.
You're talking about the left ventricle, right?
That's exactly right. So the heart, as many people may remember from biology classes, 4 chambers: left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. The left ventricle really is the powerhouse of the heart, because what that's doing is it pumps out oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. That's what you need for your organs to survive. And with depression, what's happening is you're changing the way that left ventricle looks. So it's becoming larger. That's a bad thing. It's becoming more narrow at the neck. We've talked about this thing called Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which the Japanese coined, and it's really after a fishing pot used to catch octopus. I don't know if that's what they're still using, but the point is it's really preventing your left ventricle from functioning properly. That's what chronic depression and stress can do to the physical structure of your heart. And people aren't talking enough about that.
But people aren't going to know this, right? You're not going to know this walking around. If you're depressed, stressed, lonely, you're just bummed out emotionally, you're not going to be able to self-diagnose that that's happening in your heart.
No, and most of the time, if you are depressed, there's a bunch of different things going on. You may feel fatigue, right? Partly because you're depressed, but also because your left ventricle may not be functioning well and you're not getting enough blood supply, so you're fatigued. You may start to have some fluid backup in your lungs or in your extremities, and that could be relating to other issues that you're having with in terms of your diet and other aspects. So that's what's so hard with depression or anxiety. You don't see it. You don't feel your left ventricle getting bigger, but you slowly start to develop those symptoms. And the important thing, Phil, that you and I have talked about is, conditions like heart attacks aren't sudden. People think they're sudden, like all of a sudden it just happened and people seemed well. It's a result of daily behaviors that you've been doing for years. And that's why it's so important to start addressing it when you're in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s and you think you're fine and nothing can impact you. You have high blood pressure, and I've seen it in patients all the time, 15, 20 years. They don't do anything about it. And it's that long-term complication that they experience later in life, and they're 50 and they're 60. And that's the real challenge.
If somebody's listening to us right now and they're thinking, okay, I can't feel my left ventricle changing, but I do feel fatigue. I don't have the endurance that I used to have. I do tire more easily. And I've just wondered if I'm out of shape or whatever. Maybe they are. But what should they go get done? What should they ask their doctor to check? What kind of tests should they ask for cardio-wise?
And you want to understand what your risk factors are. And those are things like age. As we get older, we're at greater risk. For men, it's typically in their 50s. Women, it's in their 60s. Certainly, if you smoke, that's a big risk factor. Being overweight, as we point out about physical inactivity. And then, your diet. But when you go to the doctor, you really should talk about what your symptoms are. And sometimes people want to please the doctor, so they may not always say what's going on. But if you're over 40, you want to be getting a cholesterol level, a whole lipid panel checked. Your cholesterol, your HDL, your LDL, and your triglycerides. And you want to be doing that every year. You want to be thinking about if you're starting to have that fatigue or you're starting to have some chest discomfort, you may need something like an exercise stress test. We talk a lot about coronary calcium scores. That's in the book. And that's really a test that really is going to correlate the amount of calcium that we see on this scan with the amount of plaque that you might have. So instead of subjecting you to an angiogram where we inject dye, we can actually do a special CT scan to look at the amount of calcium. And patients need to be informed about these tests and these procedures that can be done to really analyze what's happening with your heart. You might also need an echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound of the heart.
And that'll tell you what? If you get an ultrasound of the heart, that's going to tell you what?
That's going to tell me how big your left ventricle is,
Right.
and how well it functions, how well it pumps. That's one of the best tests that we have, especially as we're thinking about heart failure. And I get it, Phil, sometimes insurance may not cover it. There can be copays that can be challenging at times. But again, this is something that doesn't happen just all of a sudden. It happens over years. And to catch it sooner rather than later, that's going to pay off in the long term.
There's one measure they're going to give you is an ejection fraction, right?
That's exactly right. So that goes to your point where how well the heart pumps out blood, and it's oxygenated blood. So if you're in your 20s and 30% in terms of ejection fraction, imagine it's, a bowl or a bottle and you're pumping out the water. If you're only pumping out 20 to 30% of that, that's bad because you're not getting enough blood supply, and it's also backing up. So it's just staying there, and that's going to go in your lungs and your extremities, and that's going to create a lot of challenges. And it's a simple test that can be done in 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah. I've had one done recently, and I could see it on the screen.
Yeah.
And you see your heart closing, making like a fist, and there's a certain angle where it almost just disappears. It just goes flat. It's closing so much. And you get an ejection fraction, I think, above 50 is normal.
Good.
65 is great.
Even better.
And,
yeah.
I don't know whether it was covered or whatever, but I sure felt better when I saw it and saw the numbers and stuff. And they said, no, you're good to go. And they did the same thing on the arteries and all to see if there was any plaque built up, soft or hard. And if you're clean there, then that's good news.
And it's exactly right. And I talk about soft plaque and hard plaque. There's a difference in terms of, what's more dangerous, because you don't want plaque to break off, because then it travels downstream and then it clogs your blood vessel. And part of this is, as we've always talked about, let's empower people with information. And the good news is, with a lot of these new tests, procedures and lab tests, I'm going to give you your personalized data. So I'm going to tell you how much plaque you have in your blood vessels. I'm going to tell you what your 10-year risk is of having a heart attack. And a lot of times people will think, well, I'm feeling fine. I don't have any chest pain, so I don't need to worry about it. But I would argue you need to understand what your personalized risk is. And that's what's so important about giving people information that they can do something about. As you pointed out at the beginning, nothing's 100% preventable in life. But it's also not the other way, like, well, I'll just do whatever I want and I'll deal with the consequences later. Well, you might not be alive to deal with the consequences, or you may be impacted so much, quality of life is decreased significantly.
Yeah, and I think what some people don't think about is the fact that you might survive something, but how much damage has been done to the heart muscle, for example. If the heart muscle has been damaged, then the best you can do is what you're left with after the damage has been done. And if you can stop it before that damage has been done, then you got a whole lot better chance of having longevity and a quality of life. Stop it before damage happens. Because sometimes that's not all recoverable. Sometimes you can recover, but not always.
Yeah. And the longer you wait, the harder it is to recover. And just a fact for folks, heart failure is the number one reason why people over the age of 65 are admitted to the hospital.
Really?
And repeatedly admitted to the hospital. Even with all the medications we have, it is hard to treat. It is decreased quality of life. And again, it's not something that just happened all of a sudden. It's the behavior choices, including addressing stress and depression and all the other things that we're talking about for 10, 20 years. It adds up over time. And then it can get to a point where sometimes it is too late to make significant changes in the function of your heart.
Well, let's talk about the flip side, because we've said that you can have these emotions like anxiety, depression, stress that can really roll up on you and change your hormones, change the anatomy of the heart. And if the left ventricle is changed, that can recover, correct?
You can do things that can help it contract better. So there is some degree of recovery, yes.
Yeah. But let's talk about the flip side, because there is evidence that shows that emotions, attitudes, such as gratitude, can have a positive impact on areas of the brain, for example. Talk about that some.
I was in your office, as you know, a little earlier today,
Right.
and I didn't comment on it, but I noticed you have a sign that says gratitude,
Right.
don't you? And what's really fascinating about gratitude is because at first it sounds kind of corny, be more grateful and your life will be better. But what I love that you like to talk about, Phil, is what's the biochemical reason? What's going on? And what we've seen through functional MRIs and PET scanning is for those people that have practiced gratitude, and that's typically writing something down. This is how they studied it. Nearly every day in a journal, something that they're grateful for. It can be as simple as, I had a nice cup of coffee today, or I had dinner with my entire family, that they saw two areas of the brain that changed, that in some ways we could say were rewired. And the first one is the amygdala. It's a Greek word, means almond. So it's an almond-shaped area of the brain. And that deals a lot with usually emotions such as fear and anger. And what we saw is that for people that show gratitude, that area of the brain does not light up as much. It's dampened a bit. And then for an area of the vagus nerve, vagus is actually from the Latin, means wandering. What the vagus nerve does is impacts our heart rate. So it makes our heart rate go faster. It makes our breathing rate go faster. And when you're able to kind of tone down the vagus nerve, your breathing rate gets better. Your heart rate gets better, right? How do we feel when our heart's going 110 beats per minute? We don't feel so good. I feel anxious if that happens, if we're breathing too fast. So actually, the biophysiological basis of gratitude is changing the way that our brain is processing emotions and then impacting our heart rate and our breathing. So that's what I think is so exciting about gratitude, and why often when you see people that have a lot of gratitude in their lives, they seem happier in many ways.
Having gratitude in your life is, like you say, maybe that sounds corny, or sometimes I'll see people and say, "How are you doing today?" And they're like, "Oh, I'm blessed." I'm like, "Oh, okay."
Too much.
Yeah, all right. I got you. And sometimes that sounds genuine if somebody's overcome something or something great happened in their life. But what we're talking about here is we all have a strategy. Maybe we've consciously chosen it or defaulted to it or whatever, but we all have a way of being in this world. You can watch people, maybe it's a party or a meeting or something. There'll be some people that come through the door like a house afire. Man, they just come in and they just have to be the center of attention, and it's just like a whirlwind coming in the door, and everybody looks up and they're making a lot of noise and all that. Next person might come in and they just kind of drift in like a cool breeze, and they lean against the wall and they're taking everything in. Not saying one's better than the other, but they're different ways of being in the world. I always say, whichever it is or any place in between, be who you are on purpose. Whatever you do, own it. Be who you are on purpose. If one of the things that increases your longevity, increases your quality of life, increases how you impact others, is to have an attitude where every day you find things to be grateful for. That you wake up in the morning and you just do certain things that put you in a positive frame of mind, an appreciative frame of mind. If that has a positive impact on your mental health, on your physical health, Why wouldn't you do that on purpose? Why would somebody not choose as part of their way of being in the world to be grateful, to have gratitude for being alive, for having gratitude for fresh air, for whatever? I love animals. I'll be sitting at a stoplight and I'll see a couple of dogs, sitting over on the grass or in the fence, and it'll sound corny, but I have a sense of gratitude that I get to see some animals. Where I live, we call it Deerview Mountain because we have so many deer eating my flowers.
Mhm.
I'm not grateful for that, but I'm grateful for the deer. Almost every day, I get to see a family of 4 to 6 deer walking around the property, and I love seeing those deer.
Were you always like that? Because I would argue that gratitude is also something that we can learn. It's
Mhm.
also about perspective. And a lot of people, including myself to some degree, learned it during the pandemic, right? You could be overwhelmed by aspects of the pandemic, but I also learned I was grateful by being able to literally have every meal with my family that I otherwise wouldn't have done. I have two young sons and a wife,
Right.
and I normally wouldn't have had that time. So I had more time with all of them than I ever would. I actually was grateful for not having to travel so much. So I chose that perspective to some
Yeah.
degree, but I might not have always had that. So I'm curious as to whether you feel people can change their
I
perspective.
think they can change. That's what I mean by be who you are on purpose. We can be in this world and say, this world sucks, or I don't like the politics, or I don't like where I have to live, or whatever. Okay, you can choose to focus on that, and maybe that's part of your reality. But you can also choose to purposely find
Yeah.
something you're grateful
And
for.
it can be simple that there was not traffic today coming here.
Yeah,
There was, but not as much.
yeah, yeah.
So
And
I was grateful for that.
and it doesn't have to be
Yeah,
something profound.
absolutely.
I think you can choose. I used to do skills training with people, and one of the things I had them do was write down a 65 item blessings list.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that it was so long is because I wanted them to get down to things that would seem
Mhm.
trivial. So they began to look around and take note of things that they took for granted. The first 10 are easy. I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful for my spouse. I'm grateful for my kids. I'm grateful for my health. I'm grateful that I have a roof over my head. Those things are easy. When you get down to number 58, you have to look around and say, I'm grateful I got carpet on
Yeah.
the floor. But you really have to purposely look around and find things that you would take for granted that you are grateful
Mhm.
for. And like you said, maybe it's grateful that they've paved this
That's
road.
right.
I'm grateful that I'm not driving directly into the sun. I'm grateful that I get to listen to music for 15 minutes on the
Mhm.
way in instead of pissed that there's traffic. You can choose an attitude of gratitude, and it can make a huge difference. I think you and I were talking, and I don't know if we wrote about this in one of our op ed pieces that we've done together. And thank you for doing those with me and sharing those with me. But there is considerable research out there that says cognitively, we are about 30% more efficient if we have an optimistic attitude.
That's right.
Think about that. If you go into this life each day with a chip on your shoulder and just pissed off about something specific or just in general, versus saying, okay, you know what? I'm not going to be naive. I'm not going to be gullible. But I am going to find something to be
Mhm.
optimistic about, something to be happy in my approach. You can be 30% more intelligent, more cognitively efficient than if you don't. Look, I need every edge I can get. I mean, I'm old and bald. If I can get a 30% edge on cognitive efficiency, I'm going to grab it. I'm going to find something, put a smile on my
Yeah.
face. I just think people need to recognize that when you do that, that de-stresses you. And that has to lower inflammation, catecholamines, all of the different things that play into your risk for heart disease, has to lower cortisol. It's hard to be happy, optimistic, and stressed out at the same time. Those are mentally, emotionally incompatible.
I don't think enough people see it that way. And that's why I think it's so important to have these discussions. And then the challenge is they're angry, they're depressed, and they feel lousy, right? Well, there's a reason why that's the case. It's not just because they're angry and depressed, it's also what impact that's having on their mind-body connection. I think other cultures have focused much more on that mind-body connection than we have, even though we've known about it for thousands of years. We just dismiss it, or we think it's not important, or it doesn't apply to us. And that's what's so frustrating.
But why not focus on it? If you think about it, if you're all pissed off, you got a chip on your shoulder, you're going to walk around angry and upset. I've kind of noticed, generally speaking, the world doesn't seem to too much care.
No.
I mean, it's kind of like if you want to say, I'm going to go over here, sit in a corner and eat worms, the world doesn't stop spinning around. They don't care. I mean, you can impose that on other people if you have them under your thumb in some way. I mean, maybe if you're the parent and they're the child, or you're the boss and they're your employees, and you want to come in and spew that kind of toxicity. But generally speaking, the world doesn't care.
That makes them more angry.
Exactly. On the other hand, if you're optimistic and you bring that into the room, people tend to be drawn to you. It just seems to me there's a better way to go through this life than to be dragged kicking and screaming.
It's a great point. No one likes that angry friend, that angry coworker that is always annoyed about something. But, part of it, Dr. Phil, is, I think, as we've discussed, that's not our concept of health for the most part in this country. We think about health, and the medical community is partly to blame just on that physical aspects of your health. And then all of a sudden, if you have depression, we cart you off to a whole nother specialty, right? And don't want to address that issue. And we fail to recognize at times that it's a continuum. And we don't talk to patients, we don't talk to the public enough about that and its relationship to the physical health and the mental health. You can't have one without the other. And we don't always acknowledge that. And then people don't feel they need to change anything.
I guess that's why I'm saying, if you're going to be in this world one way or another, why not choose something that works for you? Why not choose something that makes you smarter, healthier, more efficient? For example, we know that if you multitask, you're going to be very inefficient. Because we know if you're working on emails and somebody comes in and says, can I discuss with you a problem on the production floor at the factory? Just take a minute. Well, we know the brain uses different parts of the brain for different tasks. Well, you've got to disengage from this, engage another part of your brain, and that takes some time.
Yeah, because your brain doesn't fully disengage from the current. I love that you point that out, because people think that multitasking is a sign that you're really smart.
I've seen sophisticated job descriptions from Fortune 500 companies. When they're describing what they're looking for, they say in a positive way, are you a good multitasker? And the right answer to that should be no. I don't multitask, because if you don't multitask, your efficiency goes up an average of 42%.
That's not going to get you the job. We're going to have to say to your point, but you're right, exactly, in terms of how staying focused on one goal is going to more likely get you that result than if you're trying 3 different things at the same time.
It takes about 15 minutes to successfully disengage from one task and effectively re-engage in a second task. That task is going to take 2 or 3 minutes. Oh no. You spent 15 minutes disengaging there and re-engaging over here to do something for 2 minutes. Now you got to go back over here and re-engage over here. So you've spent 30 minutes disengaging and re-engaging to do something that took 2 minutes. What people need to learn to do is say, if you got a few minutes, Actually, I don't right now, but if you'll just hang tight, as soon as I finish this, I'll buzz you in your office and deal with what you need. That's learning to set boundaries. That's having a strategy for the way to be in this world. It's controlling your relationships, and it's doing things that are going to be more efficient for you, your organization, your peace of mind.
And helping your health, your overall.
And it lowers your stress levels.
Without a doubt.
So that's what I mean about being who you are on purpose. That to me is the building block. That's the building block. Have a strategy, do it on purpose. When you get into like chapter 4 on page 39 of your book here, that's the first time we get into the mental emotional parts of this with depression. That's where people need to stop and say, okay, this is up to me. I have to manage this. And not only will I address my depression, but it will improve my heart health, lower my risk factors, and put me in a better position for longevity and quality of life.
You know what I learned from you, Phil? And I've learned a lot of things over the years, but something that I learned from our discussions is you noticed I put the mental health aspects of the book at the beginning.
Yes, you did.
And I put the things like diet and exercise, a menu plan that I've worked hard on, and an exercise strategy. I put those at the end. And I purposely, from our discussions, said, I'm going to put this at the beginning because I want to make sure that people read this, that I make sure I have their attention. And that's not something that I would have done, Phil, years ago.
Really?
But it's something that I've learned. I don't even know if I would have had some of those chapters in the book, but I've learned a lot. And that's where I feel that this can be a benefit for people because not enough doctors are talking about it. And you can do all those things right. And if you're chronically depressed, if you're anxious all the time, you're chronically stressed, you're still going to increase your risk. And I would argue you're still going to have lots of challenges. And if you don't address those up front and early on, it's going to create major problems.
Yeah. Well, I love your chapter towards the end, putting it all together, because you don't get to medication until chapter 9, because you put a lot of this onus on the individual.
Yeah.
To manage this.
We're too quick sometimes to say medication.
And then to medication. And then in your conclusion, it's putting it all together. I really liked that aspect of this book. Like, all right, let's tie all this up together after you've given them all the different elements and aspects of managing the risk. I don't see how anybody can read this book, and you can see mine is all dog-eared and marked up and stuff.
It's very well read. Thank you.
But I don't see how anybody can read this book and come away without a strategy for reducing their risk for heart disease. People go, yeah, it's like they can't see it, so it doesn't seem as real. But this book is going to save people's lives.
Well, thank you. And really the focus was on, because I hear this from patients all the time, tell me what to do. Tell me what to eat, Dr. Whyte. Tell me how I should exercise. And, I can't tell you everything that you can do, but I can start to provide that framework. I think about a WebMD interview we did a few years back, which is one of our most popular, where you talked about in the setting of New Year's goals, you have to have an action plan, right? You have to have a strategy. Otherwise, you're going to fail. And they're not, true goals. And that's the concept that I took for the book as well. I've got to give you a plan. And whether it's a meal plan, an exercise plan, but also a plan to address your mental health.
Yeah. And maybe this is hard for some people because when I was in private practice, I had people that I worked with for years that never knew they were depressed until they weren't. They just thought that's how life is. They never knew they were depressed until it lifted. And all of a sudden, they had an optimism about them. The sky was blue. It always had been, but they never noticed it. They walked around with their head down. All of a sudden, they looked up and looked people in the eye, and they really heard music for the first time. They saw the world for the first time, and they went, wow. It's like I've been living in black and white, and the world's in color. I've missed it all these years. And I said, it's because your depression has lifted. Biochemically, emotionally, behaviorally. And they said, wow, I never knew I was depressed. I just thought everybody was in black and white. So ask yourself, is there more to life than what I'm living? Because if in fact you're living with depression, anxiety, stress, and loneliness, there are biochemical correlates to that are burdening your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Not emotionally, burdening your heart hormonally, biochemically, and structurally, that could be shortening your life and certainly changing the quality of your life. That's like a sleeper cell that can flare up on you at any time. And if you change that, you can improve your health. You can improve your risk for having a heart attack. I'm not saying don't exercise, not saying don't have a good diet plan, not saying don't go see your internist, your cardiologist, but also recognize you can help yourself if you get yourself emotionally straight.
That's right. And life can be challenging at times. Life can be hard, but there are things that you can do. There are perspectives that you can change that really can get you on that path to better health, because you want that quality of life. It's not just the number of years, it's the quality of the years as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the book is Take Control of Your Heart Disease. It's written by my good friend, Dr. John Whyte. He's the Chief Medical Officer at WebMD. I emphasize that because that means that his access to research, his access to resources, his ability to look at the empirical science behind heart disease, he's not your average bear in what he can access.
Okay.
They have tremendous resources. They don't put anything up at WebMD until they have dug in, checked it, rechecked it, pulled up collateral studies.
And that's the case for the book. Everything has been reviewed and re-reviewed. Just, a little point that I'll make. Everything on WebMD is reviewed by a board certified physician, every piece of content.
Yeah.
And if you look closely, it'll tell you who and when it was. And everything in this book has been reviewed and re-reviewed and documented. And I include a bunch of references just so, people know it's not just my opinion. It's really based on science.
Yeah. I'm looking here in the book. You've got 36 pages, something like that, of bibliography of resources.
In tiny print.
Yeah, in tiny, tiny print that I had to put my glasses on to see, of all of this tied back to peer-reviewed research.
That's right.
From top-level experts.
I'm not making this stuff up. I mean, it's really based on the latest data and the latest science.
Which is one of the reasons I was proud to be asked to write the foreword for, because I know it's rock solid.
Well, thank you.
So again, Take Control of Your Heart Disease Risk by John Whyte, MD. You can get it where books are sold. It will change your life if you read it and do the things that are in here, which I think will save some lives. You're also a big proponent of learning CPR. You and I were working on some cases today where lives were saved because people with CPR intervened in the 4 to 6 minutes before an ambulance could get there.
And minutes matter. So that's what's really so important. And people are sometimes fearful. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. And that's why it's so important to learn about what you can do and to empower folks with the information of not just now by reading the book, how to save your life, but now learning CPR, how to save someone else's life.
We had some cases caught on tape that we looked at, and we were very fortunate to have the American Heart Association send some ambassadors out to help as well. So it's been a good and productive day. Dr. John Whyte, MD, thank you so much for being on Fill in the Blanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Phil.
Appreciate it.